Thank you all for coming to Rounds on the Go. I'm Melissa Henriksen. I'm the Director for University Engagement at the Applied Research Institute, and ARI co-hosts this event with the UVA Foundation at the Research Park. So Katie and I work together on putting this lecture series together. Before I announce our speakers today, I want to just give you a heads up that the next one of these events will be February 7th, probably, on Facebook, anti-social media, how Facebook has disconnected cities and undermined democracy. The speaker there will be Siva Vaidyanathan, who is a professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. So put that on your calendar, and we'll have information coming up shortly. But today we're very excited to hear about research that's going on right around the corner here. And so today we have Jason Forman. Dr. Forman is a principal scientist in the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department at UVA and is a principal investigator at the UVA Center for Applied Biomechanics. Dr. Forman received his BS and PhD in mechanical engineering from UVA in 2003 and 2009, respectively. Dr. Forman then served as the subdirector for science for the European Center for Injury Prevention at the University of Navarra, Pamplona, Spain. I'm going to have to ask you about the running of bulls with that situation.
Everyone does.
Before rejoining UVA in 2012. And then Carolyn Roberts is here as well and presenting. She's a PhD candidate at the Center for Applied Biomechanics in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at UVA. Before beginning her graduate studies, Carolyn graduated from Virginia Polytechnic Institute at State University and did research at NASA Langley Research Center. At the Center of Applied Biomechanics, she has worked in the field crashworthiness, rollover crashes, cervical spine injury, and military underbody. So thank you both for coming here. Please join me in welcoming.
All right, thank you all very much. So today we're going to talk about some challenges in automobile safety. So that's sort of our field, is injury biomechanics and automobile safety and how to keep people safe in cars. We're very pleased that you all could join us today as well. So the modern automobile is one of the most complicated examples of human-machine interaction in existence. So we have a constant interplay between control and feedback between the driver, the vehicle, other vehicles on the road, and other roadway systems. Now for millions of people every year, there's one other component of that interaction that's often overlooked, specifically how a person interacts with their vehicle when they crash. So every year, over 6 million police-reported collisions occur in the US alone, many millions more throughout the world. That causes about 2.4 million people to be injured and 35,000 people to be killed. So 35,000 people killed per year. That's one every 15 minutes. That means while we're here for the next hour, there are going to be 4 people in the US that are killed in motor vehicle collisions. So this is the leading cause of death for ages 16 to 25, but it's within the top 10 causes of death for people up to the age of 54. So because of this, nearly every component of the vehicle, specifically the vehicle structure and the vehicle interior, are designed with safety in mind. So we have crumple zones in the front of the vehicle that try to absorb energy during the collision. We have the vehicle structure that's designed to maintain integrity of the occupant space to prevent crush. We have energy absorbing systems inside the vehicle. Your steering wheel is designed to deform and absorb energy as you collide with it. The other components of the vehicle interior are designed similarly. And then we also have our seat belts and our airbags, which are designed to safely decelerate the person, couple the person to the vehicle, and decelerate them safely during the collision. So what are driving all these safety improvements? Well, for the most part, safety improvements are driven by crash tests. Crash tests are the standard means to evaluate safety and to evaluate designs. So what happens during a crash test? Well, we run a car into something, or we run something into the car. But we do this in a very controlled manner, and we do this with very complex array of video systems and electronic instrumentation and high-speed data acquisition systems, so we can slow that crash way down and observe what's happening to the vehicle structure, and then also observe what's happening to the occupant. In most cases in crash tests, the occupant is a dummy, a crash test dummy. So this is a critical component of what we're trying to accomplish with the crash test. We're trying to see how this dummy interacts with the seatbelt and the airbag and the other components of the vehicle. Now the dummy is like a really, really fancy ruler. It's basically a very complex measurement device. The dummy is not simply mass and rubber and steel. The dummy is instrumented with a fairly complicated array of electronic instrumentation to be able to measure all sorts of things that are happening to and inside of the dummy during the crash. So the dummy is instrumented to record acceleration experienced by the head, force generated in the neck, compression of the chest, how the chest compresses as it's loaded by the seatbelt, force in the legs, displacement in the knees, all sorts of different things. And all of these different measurements we can then take afterwards and predict the risk of a person being injured in that crash with that car with all those different safety systems. So the dummy is critical. That's how we measure what's going on during the crash test to predict injury and assess safety. Now over the years, crash tests themselves have evolved. They started out relatively simple with running a car into a rigid flat barrier like a brick wall. But over the years, they've gotten more and more complicated. Running the car into something that deforms, maybe running the car into something that really challenges the structural integrity of the vehicle. Our colleagues from IHS developed this type of testing program. And then we've also moved on to other types of crash modes, side impact collisions of various types. Some countries perform rear impact collisions as well. These span an array of different agencies and different stakeholders. Some of these crash tests are performed for regulation. Some of these you have to pass to be able to sell your vehicle in the US or in Europe or anywhere else. Some of these are not regulatory, but are for consumer information purposes. So the STAR programs, is your car rated 5 stars for safety or 3 cars for safety? That's actually a market-driven mechanism to really push improvements outside of the regulatory regime. But throughout all that evolution of different types of crash tests, one thing has remained relatively the same, and that's the dummy. So what is this dummy? This is the dummy that is used for frontal crash protection worldwide. So any crash test that involves impacting the front of a vehicle or a vehicle running into something is usually performed with this particular dummy. This particular dummy, for a little bit of history, it's fairly old. It's older than me. It's older than a lot of people here. It was designed in 1973 by a group of engineers from General Motors working with the federal government. It's designed to represent, at that time, a mid-sized male, so 5'9", 172 pounds. And again, as old as it is the standard. It has been the standard for a long, long time around the world. So how did that come to be? So I thought I'd give you a little bit of history of dummies themselves. So dummies were first developed mostly for the US military for testing things like parachutes. So very, very early dummy was basically just a bag of rope encased in a canvas sack, designed basically as just some mass for parachute testing. But the US military also developed other types of dummies that were used for things like evaluating ejection seats, evaluating protection of pilots during plane crashes, that sort of thing. So this gets a little bit into how dummies became so focused on mid-sized males, because the early dummies and all the work that went into them were very, very focused on young military men types of populations. So then we get into dummies used for automobile safety. So again, the first ones were very, very simple. One was just an articulated block of wood Originally, these weren't intended to take all those fancy measurements that I talked about, but they were more intended to just assess the integrity of the seatbelt or the integrity of the restraint systems or the occupant compartment in general. So in some cases, for that very basic restraint integrity evaluation, just a simple block of wood is okay in some cases. But then as things got more advanced, started to see more of the introduction of seatbelts and other more advanced safety systems, we wanted to get more and more refined measurement capabilities. So then we move into the 60s and 70s with the development of instrumented but still fairly rudimentary dummies. Like a lot of things, there were competing organizations, competing political factions, each developing their own dummies. The term hybrid dummy comes from the fact that there were these two competing groups that ended up compromising and putting their dummy together in a hybrid form. So now it's the hybrid dummy line. So 1971, we have the hybrid 1 dummy. 1972, we have the hybrid 2 dummy. 1973, we have the hybrid 3 dummy. Now, at that point, things slowed down. So after all that development, 1973, hybrid 3 dummy, developed by General Motors, starts to have conversations of let's get this into regulation, and then that brings standardization. And once something is standardized and regulated, it carries a lot of inertia with it, and it's very hard to change. So that's how we got to the point where a dummy from 1973 is now the standard, and it's been the standard for 40 years. Now, since then, there has been progress in other aspects. From that mid-sized male dummy, we developed, not we, but the field developed a small female dummy. The field developed a large male version of that dummy, and then also a line of pediatric or child versions of that dummy. The field also expanded to other collision types. One thing about these crash test dummies is they're very tuned to a particular crash type. So the hybrid dummy line is only good for frontal crashes. We need a completely different dummy for side impact crashes, a different dummy for rear impact, and a different dummy for pedestrian, all these different scenarios. And a lot of the work since the mid-70s in dummy development has been along these lines. So there's been progress in crash testing, there's been progress in dummy development in some areas, but still these 40-year-old devices remain the standard. What we have today is we have very, very well-designed vehicles and hyper-optimized restraint systems that are very good at protecting these two particular dummies. We do a very good job. If every one of us looked like a hybrid 3 dummy, cars would be incredibly safe. So we do a very good job at protecting dummies. But the question is, what's missing? So we have our large male dummy, we have our mid-sized male dummy, but they're built sort of like pro athletes. So this guy, he's built like a linebacker. He doesn't necessarily represent the majority of us. So most people, especially nowadays, are shaped very, very differently. A lot of people tend to be overweight or obese. And that is one of the big missing factors that's not really well captured by these existing dummy systems. The second one is this dummy really is intended to target a middle-aged male, both in its anthropometry, its shape, and also in how we interpret its measurements to predict injury risk. So we're building safety systems for middle-aged males, but the population's aging, and the aging population is more fragile. So that's one of the other main missing components. Then we also have an average male dummy and a 5th percentile female dummy, so a dummy that's intended to represent a very small female. But in doing that, it only represents a very small percentage of the female population. It represents 5th percentile. We have the rest of the 95% of women out there that this dummy doesn't necessarily represent. So we have almost the entire female population that's missing from these dummies. So that's going to be the crux of our talk. We're going to talk about each of these things and how they potentially affect safety, and what may be done about them and what some of the challenges still are. So we'll start with obesity. Good lunchtime conversation. So obesity, just to put things in context a little bit, one of the ways that we classify obesity is using a measure called the body mass index. So body mass index, it's very, very simple, and it has its limitations, but what it is, it's cut off here, but it's a measure that takes a person's mass and divides it by the square of a person's stature, so mass divided by height squared. The US CDC has classifications using that measure to classify normal weight versus overweight versus obese versus extremely obese. Again, to put it in context a little bit, so everyone knows where we are, if a person is 5 foot 4 inches tall and 135 pounds, they would be considered normal weight. 5'10", 160, normal weight. Overweight for the 5'10" person would be 180 pounds. That's me. BMI of 30, so getting into obese would be 5'10" up at 210 pounds and above. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about obese. For a person of that height, maybe around 30 or 40 pounds overweight. So again, the Hybrid 3 dummy, standard crash test dummy, was built in 1973, represents a mid-sized male from 1973. So our population has changed a bit since 1973 due to health and exercise and eating habits and all sorts of other things. In terms of obesity rates, the rate of obesity has changed quite a bit as well. So we'll step through here. This is a series of slides from the US CDC looking at rates of obesity in the US population. So this is rates of people BMI of 30 or over. As the states get darker, that means we're getting more and more obese. More people in the population are of this category. So 1986, we see a few states have 10 to 14% obesity rates. As we get later in the years, the states start to get darker. Most states are at 10 to 14%. Some are starting to get to 15 to 19%. As we get into the 90s, most states are in that 15 to 19% category, all the way up to 20%. So now 20% of US adults, 20% of the people in these states are obese now. As we get into the 2000s, we have our first state that's 25% obese. Now most states are 25% obese, and we popped into the 30s. So now we get all the way to 2010, and we have a large portion of our states, their population, 30% or more are of this obesity category. So it turns out today we're at about a little over a third. So a little over a third of US adults are obese, BMI of 30 or over, so quite a bit different from the picture from 1973. That's almost 80 million adults in the US. So what are the consequences of this? So one of the consequences from a clinical standpoint is the risk of complication. So this has been fairly well studied in the clinical literature. Obesity is associated with more complications, longer hospital stay, greater risk of death following injury. So for a given injury, after an injury has occurred, an obese person is more likely to have adverse consequences of that. This one particular quote stood out to me. For severely overweight or obese patients, they're at significant risk of poor outcome, even if they only have trivial injuries. So what we're doing here is we're now shifting the bar. What may have been considered an acceptable risk or an acceptable injury for a normal weight person is no longer acceptable to us. We really have to focus on prevention of these injuries, because if we have any injury occurring in these very overweight people, then they're going to have adverse outcomes. Then when in a collision, obese occupants are 2 to 3 times more likely to die compared to a normal weight person. So those are the sort of the clinical outcome side of it. Really highlights the point that really this is a matter of prevention. We really have to be preventing these injuries from occurring in the first place. So what are some of the challenges for that? Well, to talk about some of the challenges, I wanted to introduce some of the basic concepts for how restraints work effectively. So particularly for your seatbelt, one of the main goals for your seatbelt is to grab onto and engage the hard skeletal structures available to you on the skeleton. So for the lap belt in particular, really our goal as restraint designers and evaluators is to have that lap belt really engage the nice strong structures of the pelvis. So if you're sitting in your car, if you remember anything else from this talk, one thing I want you to take away is try to get your lap belt as low on your pelvis as you can get it. You really want to get your lap belt down low, not up in your abdomen, but down low, right on your lap, so that you can get it to engage that really nice strong part of your pelvis right there. Well, when that doesn't happen, when the lap belt is up a bit higher, what happens is instead of engaging that nice skeletal structure, it goes right into your belly. It goes right into your abdomen. Your abdomen's soft. Your abdomen's not designed to bear any load. Once the lap belt goes into the abdomen instead of onto the pelvis, then all sorts of bad things happen. Your pelvis can slip underneath the belt, causing the belt to go in even further. You have a risk of injury to your lumbar spine because all of a sudden your lumbar spine is being loaded and bent in a way that it's not supposed to. So this whole concept of having the lap belt up too high, getting into the abdomen, that's really a suboptimal restraint design or phenomenon. Well, it just so happens that one of the consequences of obesity is exactly that. As people get heavier, their position of their belt on their body tends to change. It makes sense. As a person gets heavier, they tend to wear their lap belt up significantly higher. Some of that's due simply to the geometry of the thigh. Some of that's maybe comfort or just preferences in belt routing. But you can imagine for this person here, this person's pelvis is the same size as a normal person's pelvis. It's still, that person's pelvis is seated way down here low, but their lap belt is way up here high. So when this person gets into a collision, they have no hope of that lap belt engaging the skeleton properly. That lap belt's going to go right into the belly, and it's not going to engage any nice hard structures. So some researchers from University of Michigan have quantified this fairly extensively, and I thank them. They provided us with some of this data. If you look at the position of the lap belt relative to the pelvis, you can see that it gets further and further away as a person gets heavier. BMI of 35, the lap belt is completely above the pelvis, meaning that if this person gets in a collision, the belt goes straight into the abdomen and no hope of engaging things properly. So we've looked at this actually with some dummy prototypes. So some of our colleagues that develop dummy systems have been a little bit forward thinking and said, hey, maybe we can build a dummy that can be useful for assessing some of these sort of issues. So our colleagues developed a prototype of a dummy representing a very obese person, BMI of 35. We've run some sled tests comparing how that dummy responds to restraint systems in a simulated crash compared to a normal size dummy. So this is our normal size, mid-size male dummy. This is our obese dummy. And you can see this really highlights the issue that I was just presenting. When this dummy gets into this simulated crash, the belt doesn't engage the pelvis. The pelvis slips right out from underneath of the belt. Play it again. The pelvis slips right out from underneath the belt, and the dummy ends up sitting on the floor of the vehicle. So there's no skeletal engagement at all. We see much more forward motion, and really everything is behaving in a way that the restraints are not designed to behave in. So with obesity, we have poor belt fit, we have greater mass, so that's also exacerbating some of these challenges, poor skeletal engagement and greater risk of adverse outcomes. And is any of this going to be represented or assessed by our standard mid-sized male dummy? There's no way. There's no way. So that's really one of the greatest contemporary challenges for restraint systems that we're facing. So our next topic is aging. So we're in the middle of an aging wave. So this is brought about a lot by the baby boomer generation. So we all know the baby boomers. That, coupled with increased longevity in general, has really caused us to go from a fairly small portion of the population being elderly back 40 years or so ago. Up to now, a substantial portion, and they're ever increasing. By 2030, 72 million people in the US are going to be age 65 or over, and about 1 in 10 people in general are going to be over the age of 75. So again, our population is changing. We're getting a bit heavier, but we're also getting older as a society. Now, in terms of what this means for safety and car restraint systems and all that, well, we tend to group people in categories. When we talk about aging, sort of conventional wisdom has always had us try to group people as young people, middle-aged people, and old people. But in reality, it's a lot more subtle than that. In reality, we have a continuous transition throughout our lifetime. That's true for many different aspects, but that's especially true for injury tolerance. So as we grow, as our skeletal system grows and matures, we see an increase in injury tolerance in general due to musculoskeletal development and increases in muscle and bone size, muscle mass and bone size. We see a general plateau. This plateau starts at around age 22, so we're not really skeletally mature until we're in our mid-20s. So plateaus at around age 22 and then stays steady and then starts to fall off at about age 55 or so. So it's around age 55 that we see people really starting to become a bit more fragile and start to see this general transition towards decreased injury tolerance as we get older. It just so happens that our dummy, again, is designed basically targeting this sweet spot where we happen to be at our strongest. So our dummy is not evaluating the worst case scenario. The dummy is evaluating the best case scenario. The dummy is designed to represent this middle-aged adult man. So what are the effects of aging on safety? Well, we have two main effects, and this very closely parallels the obesity side of it. So we have increases in fragility. And fragility means the acute injury tolerance, how well your body is able to bear load before breaking. And also increases in frailty. Again, like with the obesity portion, frailty is related to the risk of adverse outcomes for a given injury. So for the elderly are more likely to die and more likely to have extended hospital stays for a given injury. So if I break my arm and if a person that's 75 years old breaks their arm, the outcomes could potentially be very, very different. So in general, elderly are 5 times more likely to die than similarly injured patients. They have a greater risk of delayed death, meaning they could get an injury, go to the hospital, and then die a number of days later from complications. For us, for automobile safety, one of the biggest problems for the elderly specifically is simple rib fractures. So rib fractures for older people can result in a substantial risk of death. Again, just a simple rib fracture due to complications such as pneumonia. So what happens when you get a rib fracture? It hurts to breathe. So for young people, they can sometimes bear through that pain. They're going to heal quicker. They have a greater physiological reserve in general. For old people, if they get a rib fracture and it hurts them to breathe, all of a sudden they can't express the mucus that's built up in their lungs, right? They can't cough. It hurts them to cough. They can't get rid of all the gunk that's building up. So eventually that can lead to pneumonia, which for old people, pneumonia is very, very dangerous and can very easily lead to death. So that's why for a substantial portion of the elderly population that die in car crashes, the worst injury they have is just a simple rib fracture or a series of rib fractures. So the picture in terms of injury priorities changes dramatically with age. So for young people, the priority is the head. So for young people, they tend to get into high severity collisions. They tend to be less likely to be belted, and they tend to die from head injuries. As we get older, that priority shifts again to the chest. So old people are more likely to be belted. they're more likely to be injured in lower severity collisions, and their chest is more fragile, and they have this frailty issue, this complication issue. So for old people that are killed in car crashes, the biggest problem is chest injury. In terms of biomechanical changes, this gets to fragility, so our ability to bear load. There are a number of different changes that occur with age. The shape of our skeleton changes. The amount of bone that we have available to maintain that structure changes. The basic mechanical properties of that bone changes as well. All of this adds together and aggregates to a much lower injury tolerance. This is just simple, the risk of a person suffering rib fractures from a particular collision, in this case in a 35-mile-per-hour crash. So what everyone probably thinks of here is maybe a fairly benign crash. For us, we actually know that it's quite severe. But for a 35-mile-per-hour crash, the risk of serious rib fracture for a 45-year-old is at around 10%. It's up around 30% for a 75-year-old. So 1 in 3 people age 75 or older that get in this severity of crash are going to get severe rib fractures. That's 4 times the risk of a younger person, much lower injury tolerance. So what do we do about it restraint-wise, or what are the challenges restraint-wise? So again, for young people, the priority is head injury, and that's been what's driven a lot of our restraint system development to date. So we can reduce head injury in the young by performing very severe crash tests that are going to challenge our restraint systems and our vehicle structure. And then we can apply airbags to protect the head, and we can have very, very strong seat belts to hold the chest back and to keep the head from contacting structures in the vehicle. So seat belts nowadays, they're designed to be very precise in the amount of force that they apply to the body. But that amount of force is fairly large. Modern seat belts can apply up to 1,000 pounds or more to the chest, right? All, for the most part, designed to protect the head. For the old, the priority changes. For the old, they're getting injured in lower severity collisions. Maybe we need to be assessing safety in lower severity collisions. And the old are being injured by this seat belt that's very strong and designed to apply a lot of force because it's designed more for the younger occupants. So the priorities change. The way in which we evaluate safety for the old people need to change as well. So the last bit here, and finally, I'll let Carolyn speak. So the last bit here is on the female population, so I'll turn it over. Yep.
So Jason touched on the fact that we have a female dummy. She's a 5th percentile female, and that she might actually not represent a large portion of the population. So I'm going to start with some statistics that are a little bit older, but not actually that old. So fatality risk from the same physical impact is 22% greater for females than males. That's in 2001. It gets worse. Just wait. Females have a higher seatbelt use rate than males in fatal and injurious crashes. And also, females have a lower BMI and drive newer cars with more updated safety features, and yet they're still getting injured more. So why is that? So I just want to remind everyone that females make up 51% of the US population. So they are a significant portion of the population that we're absolutely ignoring right now. So that's what I'm trying to point out. We do have a 5th female ATD, and she was developed in 1989 and started to be implemented in crash tests in 2000. However, I'm going to try to argue to you that the 5th female crash test dummy is not a female. So we actually have no actual tool right now that can represent female response in a crash test. So her external geometry is somewhat female. A lot of the measurements are taken from a military study, a large military study for uniform fitting. However, when we look at, we assume this normal distribution represents the entire population. So basically the area under there represents every single person in the population, every single little dot under there is. So if we were to say that these represent the height and weight of everyone in the US population. So the 50th percentile male dummy basically represents the largest portion of the population it can with one measurement in height and weight. The 5th female dummy does not. So very few people are 4'11" and 108 pounds. So, you know, maybe it represents that. We'll keep going. So that's her external geometry, so just her height, her weight, and her measurements. However, Jason was talking about earlier, we need ways to predict injury, but most of our data is male, is average male data. So how do we predict how a female will respond? And what we do to do that is we scale the male response to predict the female response. So what does that mean? So basically we have a lot of data that's male that we've measured. So we're pretty confident that that is pretty good data. And we're trying to predict the female. So what we do is we create a scaling factor. And the way we do this is we take an anthropometry measurement, so like a height, or like a leg length, or depends on what you're doing, but you can also use mass as well. And we create a ratio called a scaling factor. So we take the ratio of the female height to the male height, and we multiply the male measurement by that ratio, and that gives us our predicted measurement. So does this make sense? Our assumptions for this are males and females have the same geometry, it's just larger or smaller. So if we take a cube, you know, if we multiply it by 2, we can get twice the size of the cube. Great. We also have to assume that males and females are made of the same materials in order to assume that their response would be the same, right? So does scaling make sense? So I'm going to go through these assumptions. So we're first going to look at the geometry. So we have a male skeleton on the left, and we have a female skeleton on the right. So if scaling made sense, we could just make them the same height, and they should look the same, right? So I've done that. You see any differences here? So one of the most notable differences is the pelvis. Women can give birth. Their pelvises are much more rectangular. They're wider and shorter, whereas a male is much more square. The angle is different. The strength of a circle versus the strength of an oval is very different. So why would we expect them to respond in the same way? There's also a big difference in the lower extremity following this pelvic difference. If we look at this angle of the femur, we can see a big difference between male and female. So that's going to change how we load the lower extremity and might completely change the injury tolerance there. So overall, what I want you to get from this slide is females are not small males in their skeletal geometry. So if you're looking at it and you're going, well, some of the bones look like they could be similar. Maybe we can scale just some of the bones, not the whole skeleton, but maybe we can take pieces and parts. I mean, males and females are humans. We should be able to take some data and apply it to the opposite sex. So if we just looked at a femur or just a long bone, they have a pretty standard shape. They kind of look like a beam. As engineers, we know what beams do. We can kind of make some predictions based on them. But a study in 2015 actually showed that there's a big difference in cortical area. So if you look at that cross-section, long bones have a thicker outside shell and then a thinner inside part. And if we look at the thicker outside shell, which holds most of the force and the strength, this is the difference in cortical area for males and females. So in the upper arm, females have 22% lower cortical area than males. So we might be able to use scaling in these cases, but we need to understand what the differences are between males and females to actually scale by the proper things. So most long bones are scaled by length. So for the same length, this bone is going to be much less strong because its cortical area is smaller. So we need to be scaling by things that actually make sense, and we're not doing that right now. So maybe not long bones, but other bones. So lower extremity injuries, like I was showing you, are very different from males and females. Females are much more likely to get lower extremity injuries. So if we look at the talus, which is the ankle bone, one of the ankle bones, there's a big difference recently shown between like the geometry of the talus, so that talar dome, that top part right there. And also there have been a lot of studies that have shown difference in cartilage thickness and cartilage volume on the talus. So this might change the flexibility, how the joint moves, all sorts of stuff that might change the loading for the lower extremity between males and females. Another area that's hugely different is in the neck. So for the same width vertebrae, the depth for females is much smaller. So actually, females are much more likely to get a whiplash injury, and we don't know how much this geometry effect might contribute to females having more injury in the neck. So this all goes to range of motion. So basically, bony geometry and cartilage thickness can change the range of motion, and it's been well established in volunteer studies, like clinical volunteer studies, that females have greater range of motion or greater flexibility in every joint across their body, on average. Obviously, you've got your outliers there, but on average. So another thing that can play into range of motion is soft tissue. So that goes into our second assumption, Males and females are made of the same materials. All of you are probably looking at me like, okay, I buy the geometry thing, they're not the same, that's fine, but humans are made up of muscle, bone, ligament, tendon. Yes, however, the properties are slightly different between males and females. One of the most obvious cases is bone mineral density. So what I have plotted here is I have number of fractures per 10,000 of the population versus age group. So if we just look at the left-hand side on the femoral neck, we see there's a difference between males and females starting to happen in the 50s. We see a similar difference going on in the upper end of the humerus. So what's going on at the 50s? The average age of onset of menopause is 51 in the United States. Something's happening. So bone mineral density is well established to be much worse for females because of the link between decrease in estrogen and poor bone quality. So also, if you look at the right-hand graph, we see there's also something funny going on in the younger age. So there seems to be a switchover between injury risk. And that is the average age of puberty, which is 15. So something's going on with hormones here. Don't know exactly what, but something. So one of the big differences between males and females is the menstrual cycle. So there are different sex hormones, and females have a much wider variation in sex hormones throughout the menstrual cycle than any sort of daily, yearly, whatever cycle that male might have with the testosterone. So there's a huge effect of estrogen, and while we don't know exactly what estrogen is doing or how that might be changing material properties, it seems to be doing something. So we can't really study this in car crashes because typically we don't have this data for car crash victims. But one of the things we can do is we can look at sports injuries. So people that are playing sports every day, like in high school or college athletes, you can see ACL tears are much more common for females. They're like 3 times higher for females than males. And if we look at ACL tears versus menstrual cycle, there seems to be a correlation going on. So there's a good shot that hormones are actually changing what's going on in the material properties, material response, something in the body that we don't understand. And they might change injury incidence. And this could apply to car crashes. So in addition to that, there have been significantly different stiffnesses and strengths found between male and female ligaments and tendons, which also support a lot of force in the body. And those are fairly recent studies. So this is something we haven't taken into account at all. So hopefully I've convinced you that the fit female dummy we have right now is based on data that is almost entirely male, and that we don't have a tool to predict female response because we invalidated both the assumptions that the geometry is the same and the material property is the same. So Jason was talking about injury prediction methods in his earlier slide. So we're gonna actually do a little example because we have some data. So we're gonna look at the force, it's actually in the tibia, but lower extremity force that we measured in a test. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to scale this data. So on the left-hand side, I have peak force that I measured in a test. And I have male data and I have female data. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna scale it by mass and I'm gonna scale it by leg length. So the left-hand side is mass and the right-hand side is leg length. So this is the male data that we measured. It's about 4,000 newtons that we measure for the peak. So now if I were to take that data and use either mass or leg length as that scaling ratio I was talking about and try to predict what the female would be, I get either 2,600 newtons or 2,750 newtons. Now if I actually take female data, I get around 2,000 newtons. So basically the male data in this case is over-predicting injury, under-predicting injury, because females get injured at a lower force. So what's missing? Female population. So we don't currently have a tool that's actually based on female data to predict female injury. And we're just beginning to evaluate how good or bad scaling is. So I've got a few more statistics for you that are a little newer. So female driver, so the odds for a belt-restrained female driver to sustain severe injuries were 47% higher than those for a belt-restrained male. So that tells us that our restraints are optimized for an average male. We're not actually protecting females as much, even though they're more likely to wear their seatbelts. And female drivers are more likely to experience severe or fatal injuries in rollover crashes, which are the most fatal type of crashes. And we're working on a study right now that has found that females have a much greater risk for lower extremity injury, even after we adjust for age, height, weight, and crash severity. So what that says is if I have a male and a female in the same crash, they're the same age, height, and weight, the female is still more likely to get injured. So this is something we need to work on. So, in conclusion for the female section, females are not small or male, and we do need to take sex differences into account when we're predicting injury.
All right. Thank
And
you.
back to Jason.
So I'll just wrap up quickly on a couple of slides on where we are now. So we have made some progress, and the field continues to evolve and progress. So there has been some development of a new small female dummy that is a bit more advanced and actually is starting slowly to incorporate some female specific data, kind of. But it's still designed to be a small female dummy. No matter how advanced or how accurate it gets, it's still only going to represent a very, very, very small portion of the female population. So that's something that we think needs to be worked on, doing some evaluation or generating some tools that are more intended to represent average females or at least a larger portion of the female population. Similarly, there are efforts afoot to develop an elderly model of the human body for modeling the body in computer simulations. It's encouraging, but those efforts are focused on developing an elderly model of a 65-year-old and 75-year-old man, which again gets back to some of the sort of institutional evolution of male-focused things. Whereas we think it would make a lot more sense to instead focus on elderly women, especially because the divergence in injury tolerance is much greater for women due to osteoporosis and menopause. So women tend to get more fragile faster as we age. And frankly, there are just more old women out there in the population in general due to longevity issues, differences in longevity between males and females. Females tend to make up a greater portion of the population as we get older and older. So it's a little bit frustrating to us that we're still focused so much on developing advanced tools, but still geared specifically towards men. A lot of these issues may also be exacerbated as we get into an era of having highly automated vehicles. So vehicles that are semi-automated in terms of being able to drive themselves, or even fully automated, like some of the more advanced vehicles out there that are being developed. So as we get more and more into vehicle automation, we're going to have people sitting in really weird positions. People are going to be laying down in their seat. They're going to be turned around talking to their passengers. They're going to be sitting in ways that we've never really conceived of or certainly not tried to account for in designing modern restraint systems. For something like having a reclined occupant, that's just going to exacerbate some of these issues that we saw with obesity, especially in terms of engagement of the skeletal structures and sliding out from underneath the seatbelt, those sort of things. And then lastly, one of the big selling points for highly automated vehicles is they are intended to be pushing mobility later and later in life. You have people that are self-selecting out of the driving pool now that are all of a sudden going to be going back into the vehicles while the vehicles are doing more and more of the driving for them. So the automobile occupant population is just going to get older. All these consequences of aging and protecting elderly people in collisions, those issues are just going to expand more and more as we get vehicles that can be driving around people of a wider and wider population. So in summary, we've come a long way. As automotive safety engineers in general, as a field, we've saved millions and millions of people with the technologies and the safety systems that we've implemented so far, but we still have quite a long way to go. So I think it's certainly a field that we can't be satisfied. We need to continue to push the field, and we need to continually be striving for greater improvements. So we'd like to thank you for attending, and if you guys have any questions or anything afterwards, we'd be happy to take them. So thank you. Sure.
So it seems to me that a lot of the statistics are two-dimensional Gaussian-based type things, right? So you can certainly build a scale that has second or third orders, more Bayesian or Raleigh in nature, because in a model you're really doing force mass, very specific geometry measurement, and those could easily be algorithmically adjusted at a second or third order calculation for for bone mass, flexibility, density. Does anybody take a look at that? And that would be cheaper than going to the experimental, a full-on experimental measure.
Yeah, so it's a very good point, and I hope I address your question. But yeah, so certainly one of the big challenges with the way things have been done historically up to now is, since we've been so focused on physical tests, if we're trying to evaluate these systems in a physical manner, we have to have a very deterministic approach, because when we run a test, we have to have a specific dummy in that test. So just the fact that we're evaluating the systems physically means that we need a single deterministic tool that's evaluating a specific size of occupant. But what we're trying to push the field more towards now is to utilize simulation capabilities. So now that we have computer models of the body, we can modify the computer models of the body in the way that you're talking about, so that instead of optimizing systems for a single occupant size, we can incorporate uncertainty, and we can build models that sweep the range of anthropometries and occupant characteristics in the population. And if we're smart about it, we can do that with a weighted probability distribution of the occupant characteristics, and develop predicted outcomes, find all the nonlinearities, all that. So we're starting to push into that, but that's still in its infancy.
Yeah, the one thing that also comes to mind is, if you're changing the data collection source with a different physical dummy, you're now corrupting, because you're taking measurements in a different way, and you're collecting what I don't want to say corrupted data, but your reference points are no longer based on the same original data collection source.
Yeah, and that is one of the challenges, and that's one of the barriers we run into anytime we try to make improvement, right? And actually that gets to a bit of why it's so incredibly difficult to change things once they've become standardized and become an industry practice. Because you're right, as soon as you change, you can no longer go back to compare it to the way things were done before. But one thing that we can do, and one of the ways that the field is addressed that, is to keep the old way as a baseline, right? So you still have to fulfill all the old criteria, and then everything on top of that is just icing. You try to make improvements that don't have a negative impact on those baseline evaluations, but just try to make improvements on top of that. Yeah. Yep, sure.
I have a question that's more practical. What's your recommendation for kids who are out of the booster seat, but the harness hits them so I guess maybe a 4-foot tall elementary school kid, just as an example. So the harness in the back seat hits them, with me, and I'm short. It's
Sure. Yeah, so the short answer is they should be in the booster seat until it fits them properly. It's a hard thing to convey, and that's one of the challenges in designing, not only designing the booster seats, but also designing the recommendations around the booster seats. Most everyone, I'm thinking of the way that this is done in different countries, most everyone is basing booster seat recommendations not on age, but on height, specifically for that. Because really, the booster seat doesn't know the age of the child. The restraint system doesn't know the age of the child. Really, the things that matter are the size of the child. So you really want to have them in the booster until they're capable of having the seatbelt fit them properly, and then they can move on to not having the booster. Yeah.
That brings me to this, the female dummy thing is insane. Because I have an 11-year-old girl who is 5'2" and weighs 100 pounds. She's bigger than that dummy, so what, I mean,
But she's probably better protected than most of the female population, just given she's in the height and weight.
Right.
But that female dummy is the size of an average 12-year-old male. And I think it's actually might be more representative of a very, very small male, like a first percentile male, than anything else.
Yeah. And again, we, as researchers, we spend a lot of time criticizing dummies and criticizing tools and everything. So we don't want to take away from the fact that those dummies have allowed us to make significant safety advancements, right? So having the small female dummy there is a good thing. It's not going to be addressing all the problem, and we know that, again, having physical evaluations, we got to give the car designers something that they can use, right? So we got to give them dummies of a size, and that's never going to be perfect. But what we can do now is we can start to push the field to try to extend beyond those evaluations and try to do their own independent evaluations using simulation or whatever else. They can build computer models of all different sizes of people. It's just a matter of taking those different models and actually using them and trying to improve their systems outside of what we're mandating, right?
And Jason also talked about the new development for the fifth female Thor. I mean, while it's not representing a huge portion of the population, we're actually putting female data in there. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there is some representation in there, and if we're protecting a female that's much smaller and much more frail, it might not be such a bad thing for the female population in general. So we are moving towards the right step, but we're definitely pushing to get more female data in there.
Mm-hmm. Who's first? Maybe in the back? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like, and you touched on this a little bit about with automated self-driving cars, that the restraints might need to be designed differently. So I'm just wondering, it seems like there's a race between the technology and the popularity and affordability of that technology becoming more prevalent and common in society, and then the research that's happening that's only just starting to catch up. So do you think that in the next 10 or 20 years the prevalence of self-driving cars will kind of outpace the research of the restraints research?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so we that's been brought up in our field for a while now. There are some people out there that think that self-driving cars will get rid of collisions entirely, which is sort of a different question. But our thought, and it's common thought in the field now, is even if we had every new vehicle sold today, even if every new vehicle was a self-driving car, it would still take 20 years to get 80% market penetration of those. We're still going to have old regular cars on the road for a long, long time, and they're still going to be crashing into things, and they're going to be crashing into newer vehicles that do have greater degrees of automation. So in terms of pacing of technologies and everything, I think one of the things that we're pushing for, and most other folks that are in the field are pushing for, is to not let the automation side distract from the occupant safety side, because we still need to, if nothing else, we need to be protecting people in automated vehicles as well as we're protecting them in newer vehicles. There are some benefits to vehicle automation technology that we might be able to leverage to improve some of these interior restraint and occupant safety aspects. One of the biggest things that we think might be able to be leveraged to add an additional benefit is these vehicles, as you increase automation, they're getting very complex, and they have very complex control systems, and they have decision-making hardware inside the vehicle, making decisions on how to control what the vehicle does in terms of how it's driving. You could also use those same systems to let the vehicle decide how to apply restraints to the occupant when a collision is happening. So you could have the seatbelt have an adjustable limit to the amount of force that it's applying. You could have the airbag have an adjustable amount of force that it's applying. Those same control systems that are being integrated into the vehicle automation from the driving side could also be leveraged to be making decisions on the restraint and the safety side. So I think in terms of pacing of technology, if we can push to have the vehicle automation technology leveraged and applied to the interior occupant restraint as well, I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
Any information from like professional racing?
Yep.
And do they do anything different for the women?
That's a good question. There's,
In professional racing.
yeah.
So professional racing restraints are very personalized. So basically they have a seat that's molded to your shape. There's an 8-point seat belt, so you have belts going everywhere. So they are personalized to your like external geometry, but I don't think they do anything else that I know of additionally for female drivers. But there's just a lot more locked in that you can't move very much with the professional racing.
Have we ever thought about doing that very same thing, being more personalized and how we have our safety belts installed?
Yeah, so actually, going back to the kids question, one of the challenges for kids now is we're trying to fit kids into seatbelt systems that are made for adults, right? So one of the recent conversations in the field has been more along the lines of, well, why don't we just design the seatbelt systems in the rear seat to either be designed specifically for kids to begin with, or have them be adjustable to the extent that you can adjust the fit on the kid without having to have all sorts of third-party peripheral devices, booster seats and all that. So yeah, it's in the conversation. It's always one of the big drivers here since we're in a market in a market-oriented environment is basic cost. A lot of these things just cost money. And the car companies, since they're building millions of cars a year, they're counting dollars and cents. So if it costs $3 more to put in a personalized seatbelt, that certainly would affect the decision-making process for that. Going back to the automated vehicle thing, again, we think one of the places that we can really push advancement in these restraint technologies is having adaptability. So like what you suggest, not maybe on the belt fit side, but then also on the personalized, how does that seat belt or airbag, how does it apply force to the person? And you could have an adaptable seat belt that modulates the amount of force and makes the deceleration more gentle if you're in a lower severity, lower speed crash, and maybe bring that force level down to the point that maybe it won't injure a 75-year-old. Maybe it'll be soft enough to safely decelerate them without injuring them. So we think, adaptability and customization around that is one of the ways that we can improve things.
So with all the different variables kind of being at play, about what percent of the population is actually safe based on what we're using right now?
They're all safer than they were.
Yeah.
So I rant about the female thing a lot, but females are still humans. The fatality rate has dropped since dummies were implemented and car crash technology is implemented. Just you're more likely to get injured if you're female. So I mean, they do protect humans overall.
Yeah.
Just it helps more if you're average male than not. So I don't know if there's a percentage, but I do think they help everyone.
And
humans are humans.
Yeah. So the systems are certainly optimized for a mid-sized male. But I mean, the good thing is, again, we nitpick and as scientists, we're trying to make improvements, but something's better than nothing, right? So a lot of these systems are still very, very good at what they do. It just happens to be when we're designing them as a field and optimizing them, so really tweaking them and dialing them in, they happen to be optimized with a very specific target in mind. And as you get further away from that target, then their performance likely degrades a little bit as you get further away. So I don't want to necessarily say, I don't want to say that seatbelts are not safe. Seatbelts are very, very safe. Seatbelts are very, very good. They're very effective at protecting people. They drop your risk of death in a collision by about half, by about 45%. but everything could be better, right? So I think we're just striving to make things better and bring that fatality rate down to 0. Yeah. So.
Any other questions? Great, that was super fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.